Agreed.
Good morning. Welcome back to the second day of the 2025 Spring Symposium of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. Really pleased to see you all here this morning on a beautiful day, officially into spring. Yesterday's conversations were truly enlightening for me personally, and I hope that you also took away some insights from them. They are available online, and we'll be cutting them into sort of panel size and talk size pieces so you can revisit some of that or share them. This morning, we have a different agenda than we did yesterday when we were taking a tour of the globe and taking the temperature of democracy's state in various continents and finding the commonalities amongst our challenges. Today, we're taking a more thematic approach, thinking about things in different categories. And perhaps a bit more amorphously and less respecting less the national borders or even the regional or continental borders that separated our panels yesterday. So the first of these panels is dedicated to the question of how artificial intelligence will shape democracy, and I'm really thrilled to welcome our panelists, and I will hand things over to our chair, who is Professor Mike Serazio of the Communications Department. Mike has been a supporter of the Clough Center and our programming for several years, being especially instrumental in the year we dedicated to journalism and democracy. You can find a journal online with some of those proceedings as well, or you can see Mike's influences. But for now, please join me in welcoming this morning's first panel.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to do a few introductions for our panelists, then I'll open with some remarks, and then I'll pass it along to our panelists. The other folks on the panel are indeed Nicholas Hayes-Mota. He is a social ethicist and public theologian and an assistant professor of religious studies at Santa Clara University. Working within the Catholic tradition, his primary research explores the role of religion in democratic public life, the ethics of democratic citizenship, and the possibility of a politics of the common good in today's highly pluralistic and often contentious societies. Before coming to Santa Clara in 2024, he was assistant director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy at Boston College. His scholarship and teaching is also informed by his 15 years of experience as a practitioner and teacher of community organizing. And our third panelist is Anina Schwarzenbach. Anina is a sociologist and postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology at the University of Bern. Her research lies at the intersection of sociology, criminology, and political science. Her work combines tools from the computational social sciences with standard statistical analysis to study social norms, inequalities, and resilience. So as a lead-in to the subject of AI, politics, and democracy, I'd like to start with an AI clip that went viral a few weeks back.
Tunnels coming to set you free, bringing the light for all to see. No more tunnels, no more fear. Trump Gaza is finally here. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new light. Feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza #1. Trump Gaza shining bright, golden future, a brand new light. feast and dance, the deal is done. Trump Gaza, #1.
So if the main dilemma of our AI era resides not just in discerning real from fake, but what we even mean by those terms, then this clip begets a slightly different epistemic provocation. When President Trump posted this, was it real, as in serious, sincere, or was it inauthentic, as in a cruel nihilistic joke played upon a population that's been destroyed into submission? Because it feels to me, at least, more the latter. I would argue that this isn't actually an ad selling Gaza reconstruction or imperialist foreign policy or even Trump's gaudy aesthetic style. The substance of media content forever distracts us from the impact of the form that it takes. Intentional or not, this is an ad for AI itself, and that makes more sense. For the past few years, there has been a massive financial and ideological investment in getting people to adopt AI into their daily lives, both personally and professionally. $1 trillion bubble of market capital hinges on the fate of that effort to get us to see our futures, be they democratic or not, as necessarily linked to AI. McKinsey boasts that 30% of information work could be automated by decade's end. In this vision, entire categories of labor, even industries as a whole, may well vaporize, leading to not just widespread unemployment, but a loss of human self-worth and meaning relative to the machines. This would surely destabilize democracies all the more. And there's a cliche that you increasingly hear. AI won't take your job. The person who knows how to use AI will. But that sounds more like a corporate threat just masquerading as historical inevitability. Nothing's inevitable, by the way. Outcomes are only made to seem as such in retrospect. The question for our labor fate is whether AI wants to augment or replace us. Yet, at present, 2/3 of employees still never actually use AI, which isn't going to make a fortune for those big tech companies and their venture capitalists. So they're racing and jockeying and battling to establish first-mover advantage in this space. They're seeking to become monopolistically synonymous with AI, the way that Google is with search, Amazon with retail, and Meta with social networking. Win that race and you win the future, so says Silicon Valley. For in Silicon Valley, the future is always better than the present. OpenAI is worth $150 billion, which is an impressive projection for a startup that reportedly loses $7 billion per year. Again, these companies need us to use and adopt their products to both improve the quality and the valuation of them. Our suspicion of AI is well warranted because, again, AI is an epistemic provocation wrapped in a technological advance. In 2024, when roughly half the world's democratic population went to the polls, much anxiety accompanied the prospect of automated disinformation churned out at unfathomable speed and scale. Early in the year, we got a sneak preview of this when a robocall impersonating President Biden's voice urged Democrats not to vote in the New Hampshire primary. Such deepfake content, both audio and video, can be produced and circulated quickly, cheaply, and convincingly. And it often functions to suppress turnout, manipulating political facts and promoting voter apathy and mistrust. Much like previous campaigns, nefarious foreign governments seeded these on social media to interfere with election outcomes, as did domestic conspirators. Taylor Swift had to disavow an AI-doctored image that Trump posted online, illegitimately claiming her endorsement. Chatbots hallucinate, sometimes propagandistically. One study found that only 3 of 5 common AI platforms correctly answered the question, who won the 2020 US election? Another study found that almost half of the images alleging election fraud were AI created. Now, all that said, in 2024, most AI use in politics actually involved sophisticated machine learning to help make sense of millions of voter profile data points, drafting more effective campaign messaging, and streamlining media buys and ad spends. All that more boring behind-the-scenes kind of stuff. Meanwhile, dominant social media platforms have abandoned the fact-checking ramparts. Whether it be X or Meta, content moderation is rhetorically positioned as anathema to free speech. But here too, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are hiding behind substance to occlude us from paying attention to the perils of form. They might loosen the rules so that you can be a politically incorrect jerk or a propagandist divorced from reality and call that unbiased anti-censorship. But they'd never actually allow free speech to apply to the design of the algorithm itself, one that is unmistakably biased toward hijacking our attention through the most emotionally charged content possible. Meanwhile, the quality of output in an AI system is only as good as its inputs. Large language models are as voracious for new training data as they are for the server electricity that powers them. Depending on your legal interpretation of fair use, a massive amount of that data has been scraped or stolen from the open web without consent, triggering lawsuits like the New York Times against OpenAI. Much like social media before it, AI systems need our participation, our content, to stay sharp, dynamic, and thus profitable. But they're running out of data to binge on. The Times is actually the rare news organization partnering rather than suing rather than partnering with AI companies, selling access to journalistic content, the stuff upon which democratic futures depend, at what I think is a short-sighted price. Recall a decade ago, these same news companies hitched their business models to social media distribution, which did wonders for traffic until Zuckerberg turned off the spigot and prioritized family and friends content over current affairs-oriented content. Gobs of what is being called AI slop increasingly populate internet search spaces, social media feeds, and your undergrad's term papers. Synthetic, spammy sludge that's effortless to churn out at monumental scale and therefore holds little informative or democratic value. OpenAI generates an estimated 100 billion words per day. If AI systems are trained on that polluted AI content rather than high-quality, diverse, human-generated data, in other words, if AI output becomes AI input, that risks model collapse, much like the photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy is never as crisp or helpful as the original. Likewise, such AI output regresses toward a glitchy, incoherent, narrowed capacity for representing political reality. What happens when the top 10 results on Google all get made from AI fluff? What, for that matter, happens to the news business? Again, a foundation of democratic futures, if readers settle for Google's AI summaries that dominate search results rather than clicking through publisher links. What happens? An estimated 25% loss of web traffic and $2 billion in ad revenue. After 2 decades of falling revenues, dwindling subscribers, and gutted newsrooms, journalism can scarcely survive one more digital innovation. Who will populate the AI sources when content creators can't make a living anymore? And finally, what to make of companion apps? Now one of the fastest growing parts of the AI industry, with millions of users relying on them not for intellectual efficiency or professional productivity, but simple social satisfaction. These will almost surely be deployed by political candidates to give you a more personalized campaign treatment, because that's been the trend lines for decades of micro-targeting persuasion techniques. You could talk to an AI fake Trump avatar about tariffs, sure, but you'll probably talk to him about, the wimpy water pressure in showers these days, because that's what the designers and programmers want you to talk to them about, not exactly Habermas's public sphere. And what sort of democratic futures will be possible in a post-literate AI world? The embedded ideal, the meta message of AI, is to have read without ever having to read. Why engage with a text directly when a robot can just cut to the chase on your behalf? That's AI's cult of efficiency, which has informed every engineering breakthrough since the Industrial Revolution. Now, will AI afford necessary tools as all the advertising and ideology pushes on us nowadays? Undoubtedly. But just as we shape our tools, they in turn shape us, and it's usually toward unreflective, unintentional ends. There will be ideals and values that we cherished before, democratic even, but now in the AI era, they will matter less for the sake of efficiency. So when we're sold these messages about AI, just remember, you don't have to believe them. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll turn it over to Nicholas.
Good morning. My name, which is not visible because I was a truant and forgot my name tag on the second day, is Nicholas Hayes-Mota. I'm again a professor at Santa Clara University, and my focus is on public theology and social ethics. So I'm interested in approaching AI from an explicitly normative perspective. And just to acknowledge where we're at, artificial intelligence is developing at a dizzying pace, as is the conversation around it. Boosters say we're headed towards utopia within the next few years. Doomers say that we're headed towards dystopia within the next few years. Skeptics maintain it's a nothing burger or something like it. And in the midst of all of these voices, how do we begin to get ethical and political traction on some of the salient issues raised by AI? For the purposes of our gathering, how can we understand some of the key relationships between AI and democracy? What are some of the salient risks and opportunities AI presents to democratic societies? Those are the questions I'd like to begin to get on the table in these brief remarks. And I'd like to suggest that deliberative democracy poses an especially illuminating framework for thinking through some of them. Before I begin, just a little bit, when we're talking about AI, it's important to acknowledge we're talking about a pretty diverse family of technologies, from good old-fashioned AI to generative AI to the artificial general intelligence that is now the aspiration of many developers. And there's also a spectrum from algorithmic technologies, which we've been discussing for a while, to artificial intelligence. And that has some bearing on what I'll be saying. So I'd like to start by giving a little bit more flesh to this concept of deliberative democracy. What is it, and why might it be useful for thinking about artificial intelligence? Deliberative democracy has developed really over the last 3 to 4 decades in political theory initially, although it's become influential elsewhere. And following a couple theorists in the field, I understand it as being at least 3 things. The first is a theoretical model of democracy, an alternative to other models that understand democracy in more minimalistic terms, as a set of institutions premised on majority rule, elections, rule of law, etc. Also an alternative to conceptions of democracy that focus only on the normative principles that underlie it, such as equality, liberty, and so on. Both of those are important to most deliberative Democrats, but deliberative Democrats go further and say a critical benchmark for a democratic society is having spheres where the public, i.e. the body of citizens, can actually engage in shared reasoning together about issues of common concern. So if we're trying to understand what makes a democracy, that's a very important criteria. The others may be necessary, but they're not sufficient. And there are many different ways of formulating that comprise some of the major debates in the field. But this focus on public deliberation, reason-giving, mutual justification for our public decisions is critical to deliberative democracy. Because deliberative democracy is a demanding conception of democracy, it also functions as a normative ideal that can guide our aspirations as a society, what should be working toward, and also inform our critiques of the society we live in, because no existing democratic society, safe to say, fully approximates the ideal towards which most deliberative theorists are working. So it functions as a normative ideal as well. As such, it also provides a basis for practical experimentation and application of various kinds, which has been growing over the last 2 decades. How do we actually put this ideal of a deliberative public into practice? And so there have been various developments, citizens' assemblies, deliberative polls, that try to really embody that ideal in new forms of democratic processes and institutions. And that has relevance for the AI conversation. Finally, deliberative democracy is also a higher order, evaluative and epistemological framework. It's premised on the recognition that in modern democratic societies, we encounter a rich variety of pluralism. Pluralism of values, pluralism of perspective, pluralism of even epistemic criteria. How do we adjudicate the contention within that pluralism? Deliberative Democrats say rather than prescribing a fixed answer, we open that to deliberative process. And so it functions also as a way of thinking, how do we engage moral questions in an increasingly fractious public realm? Deliberative democracy also, understood in those terms, provides some useful criteria for assessing AI from a normative as well as political perspective. I'd like to say we can think of at least three basic criteria when asking, what will AI do for democracy, for good and for ill? First, an epistemic criterion. We can ask, how might AI affect the cognitive quality of deliberation that takes place within a democratic society? Will it promote better deliberation and thereby inform better decision-making, or will it inhibit it and degrade it? A second criterion is ethical. Most deliberative Democrats would acknowledge that the practice of deliberation depends on certain values. We need to have values of mutual respect, taking each other seriously, being honest, being fair, being reasonable, being civil. How might AI contribute either to the promotion or the undermining of those values that are critical preconditions for the practice of deliberation in public? And then a third question is a purely democratic criterion understood in terms of participation. How might AI contribute to the extent of participation in deliberative processes within a democracy? Does it expand and enhance citizens' capacity to engage in meaningful deliberation with each other? Or does it actually shut it down? Right? And just to note here, one of the key tensions within deliberative democratic theory has been between really the first and second and the third of these criteria. Many sound practices of deliberation require relatively small contexts, a small number of citizens, often highly facilitated and intentionally structured. How do you square that with the challenge of mass participation? That's also an aspiration of many deliberative Democrats. One of the reasons deliberative Democrats have become interested in AI is because they see potential for trying to bring those three commitments together. Now, on the negative side of the ledger, and this goes to many things Professor Serazio was saying earlier, I think it's important to acknowledge the prospects of AI contributing to deliberative democracy as it's presently instantiated are not all that good. There are dangers on all three of these fronts, starting with obstacles to the epistemic criterion. AI engendered misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes are already poisoning the information ecosystem on which our public sphere relies for informed public conversation. And that process is rapidly accelerating. This was already an issue with algorithmic technologies. It's become even more of an issue since the dawn of generative AI, because it makes the generation of disinformation much cheaper, much easier. And it's highly accessible even to those who don't have a whole lot of technical expertise in the field. As it does that, it's not only leading to citizens' acceptance of falsehoods, it's gradually eroding citizens' capacity and even motivation to discern the truth, which is critical to the epistemic function of deliberation, as well as their trust in its purveyors, in government, in truth-seeking institutions. And so this is a really serious problem. And finally, AI is also undermining and risks further undermining some of the critical truth-seeking institutions in our society. Professor Serazio mentioned how it threatens the economic model of news organizations and journalism, which is true. It also threatens the economic model of higher education, another critical truth-seeking institution. So AI is posing some pretty serious epistemic obstacles to democracy deliberatively understood. It's also posing ethical obstacles. Remember, deliberation depends on certain key values, moral preconditions for its practice. How well is AI embodying those, contributing to those right now? Not all that well. Much of what we see, it seems to be exacerbating polarization, fragmentation, mutual distrust, mutual disrespect, uncivility. It's also beginning to risk and could further risk devaluation of human interaction itself. If I can interact with an AI for any number of reasons, why do I need to interact with another human being in the public sphere, especially one who disagrees with me? So this is another front on which we have concern to be worried. Finally, on the democratic front, with regard to participation, already big tech companies, big data, and algorithms were subjecting citizens to highly impactful but non-transparent, non-accountable decisions and non-explainable decisions by automated technologies and the elites who developed them. And with AI, this problem has become even worse, both because it is increasing the pace at which those decisions are being made, but also because of the explainability problem of AI itself. Even its developers don't understand a lot of what goes on under the hood of AI. So given that, how can democratic citizens possibly understand it and hold it accountable? A pretty serious problem. As this happens, more and more decisions of great social impact, potentially massive economic impact, for example, are being removed from citizen input. And so on the democratic front, too, AI raises serious concerns. Now, many deliberative Democrats, including myself, would say the conversation mustn't stop there. There are also hopeful alternative futures for AI. On the epistemic front, many of the problems that AI causes could be counteracted by suitably designed AI. AI can be programmed to expose citizens to unfamiliar views, to identify AI-generated information, to counteract misinformation. There are already experiments of those kinds going on both at AI companies and at universities working in tandem with them. AI could be used by some of the same truth-seeking institutions, like news organizations, like universities. It would require adaptation, but it could strengthen them in various ways if used appropriately and if designed accordingly. Similarly, AI could promote more respectful, rational, and civil interaction among citizens. There are, again, experiments along those lines. How can AI be used to promote deliberation among selected groups of citizens that actually approximates the deliberative ideal and disrupts citizens' patterns of mutual distrust and uncivility? It could be used to support rather than replace human engagement. One of the major discussions in the AI field, particularly in AI ethics, is how to create a human-centered AI, one that enhances human capability rather than substituting for it. And that has bearing in the democratic sphere as well. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, and this to me is the most exciting possibility in a way, AI could make mass deliberation at scale possible in unprecedented ways, because deliberation is difficult, it's expensive. Convening deliberative publics is highly time-consuming. Having facilitators to manage deliberative processes requires trained expertise, requires money. AI could do a lot of the things required to make public deliberation possible. Synthesizing information, exposing citizens in an intentional way to views that both converge and diverge from their own, identifying possible points of consensus. There are a number of fronts on which AI can be used in a deliberative way. And so there is a kind of deliberative utopia of AI that has begun to develop among both AI developers and political theorists. Now, how do we determine which of these two futures we move towards? Because we're moving a lot further towards the first than towards the second. Right? To close there, I'd suggest a lot hinges on how to align the development of AI itself with democratic values and deliberative democratic objectives. Much of that will depend on how developers, programmers, companies are informed by that set of values and objectives. And some are starting to propose, have already begun to implement, incorporating deliberative democratic processes not only into the governance of AI at the policy level, but also into the development of AI technology itself. And some AI developers are explicitly interested in that. Whether their intentions are fully good faith or not is something we can discuss in our conversation. So that's where I'd like to conclude, with these two possible futures, one increasingly a reality, one a more distant but possible ideal. How do we ourselves take a role in moving towards the latter rather than the former? Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody. I want to start by thanking Jonathan and the Clough Center for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak about a topic I'm very passionate about. So my presentation explores the consequences of embodied artificial intelligence, or embodied AI, for society. I argue that the concept of resilience helps us understand both the vulnerabilities and the opportunities of embodied AI for democracy. So what is embodied AI, you may wonder, if you haven't come across the term yet. It refers to AI systems that are integrated into physical bodies or devices, like typical example are robots. These systems interact with the environment through sensory-motor functions and situational awareness, enabling a feedback loop where physical interaction continuously informs and refines decision-making processes. So I brought a couple of examples to show how embodied AI is rapidly transforming key social domains. In education, you have Captcha AI, the robot that delivers interactive lessons using gesture recognition and real-time engagement to enhance learning. In healthcare, you have Paro, a robotic baby seal that offers companionship for elderly patients and is said to improve mental well-being. At least that's what the company claims. In security, you have K5, here seen as patrolling the streets of San Francisco, that autonomously patrols designated areas, collecting and analyzing environmental data to assist security operations. In disaster response, then, you have Photokite Sigma, which is an unmanned drone aerial system, and then you have Colossus that is employed for firefighting. And then obviously you have, I couldn't not mention Boston Dynamics since we are here, one of the most well-known probably, the Spot Robot Dog. So, as governments struggle to keep pace with technological advancements, embodied AI challenges existing legal frameworks and creates regulatory uncertainties. In my opinion, two issues emerge when considering the societal implications of embodied AI. First of all, the question of the physical manifestation of power. Embodied AI establishes new regimes of surveillance that extend beyond digital monitoring into physical space. And then there is the question of consent. Embodied AI in public spaces creates unavoidable interaction with sensing technologies, fundamentally altering civic consent. With the proliferation of embodied AI, experts argue that we might reach new levels of economic productivity and prosperity. Yet, the integration of embodied AI in key sectors of society also risks job displacement, increasing inequality, and social isolation. So to understand these changes, we need a robust analytical lens, and I argue that the concept of resilience offers such a lens. Let me quickly define it. Resilience is defined as a society's capacity to absorb, adapt to, and recover from disruptions while preserving core functions and identity. The concept itself originated from material sciences, where resilience quantifies a system's ability to recover or bounce back after an external shock or disruption. It has ever since been applied also widely in the social sciences to understand how individuals, communities, but also whole social systems respond to and adapt to stresses such as economic crisis, natural disasters, and terrorist attacks. In my opinion, what makes this concept really useful to think through some of the consequences of embodied AI for society and democracy is that research has identified key attributes that build resilience at the community and system level. And among these are trust, cooperation, self-organization, diversity, continuous social learning, and adaptive governance. So let's take a quick closer look at those. Trust is the confidence citizens place in institutions and in each other, while cooperation involves shared responsibilities and mutual exchange. Together, trust and cooperation strengthen social cohesion and empower collective action, and as such, they are really cornerstone of resilient societies. The challenges I see that if we introduce robots into sensitive areas like healthcare, this brings up important questions related to trust. Embodied AI systems collect visual and sensor data, sparking concerns about consent and privacy. In our homes, while autonomous robots might offer emotional support, they risk undermining community bonds and deepening social isolation, bringing to what experts call digital loneliness, by replacing genuine human interactions with superficial digital connections. So we really need embodied AI systems. We need them to be designed as such that they support human cooperation, incorporate community oversights, and operate under transparent protocols, so that they garner greater trust and are better positioned to complement response efforts, preserve genuine connections, and address locally defined priorities. Then we have self-organization, which is more at the systemic level and consists of multiple independent yet interconnected modules that enable decentralized decision-making. And why that is important, you just have to think what happened at Heathrow Airport. So it's a question of resilience there as well, and of systemic resilience. Diversity implies maintaining a variety of institutional types and governance models, each offering unique perspectives while ensuring that technology serves all members of society. Together, self-organization and diversity mitigate single points of failure, and thus they are really key to systemic resilience. The risks I see is that if embodied AI is centralized, has a centralized decision making in the hands of only few technical experts rather than democratically elected representatives, we really put self-organization and diversity at stake. And also, these systems may widen the digital divide because they turn access to advanced AI technologies into a privilege for affluent communities while marginalizing others, thereby deepening existing inequalities. So we need systems that are embedded in programs that enable diverse community members to meaningfully participate in oversight, regardless of the technical background of the involved individuals and stakeholders. Finally, for continuous social learning and adaptive governance, those are important because these are kind of more the process and mechanistics where we gather feedback, learn from past experience, which is also key, and iteratively define policies and practices. And they help to sustain resilience over time. So as embodied AI advances, and AI more generally, it will surpass human capabilities in tasks execution and knowledge acquisition in a variety of domains. So I really believe that we need to challenge our educational systems to shift from traditional knowledge-based models towards approaches that emphasize creativity, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, and ethical reasoning, areas where we as humans arguably still hold an advantage and which are critical for an effective AI oversight. So let me conclude. Embodied AI presents democratic societies with profound opportunities alongside unprecedented challenges. Its physical presence that manifests power in public spaces, changes civic consent dynamics, becomes embedded in critical infrastructure and establishes new surveillance regimes through advanced perception capabilities, influencing everything from personal healthcare to public safety and civic participation. In this context, I feel like resilience proves to be a double-edged sword, because what we surely do not want are highly resilient embodied AI systems that are operating without any human oversight. These systems are characterized by self-organization and autonomous decision-making and may develop emergent behaviors that elude human prediction and control. Ulrich Beck, the sociologist, warned in his Risk Society theory that technological advancements often yield unintended consequences that must be anticipated and governed. What we do want, I feel, and what we do need is to invest in a proactive human-centered resilience, to move towards a future where embodied AI reinforces democratic values, strengthens social cohesion, supports human decision-making, and empowers communities alike. I feel like that as we look ahead, the question is not whether embodied AI or AI more generally will transform our society, but rather whether we can cultivate community and system-level resilience to ensure that this transformation upholds and expands democratic values. The future of democracy depends on our ability to maintain human-centered resilience and to adapt, learn, and grow in tandem with the technologies that increasingly define our everyday lives. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for two very thoughtful papers and presentations on this. I see we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left before our next panel. In the interest of keeping us on time, I was going to throw a question to both my colleagues here and then an individual question to each of them. My opening question here is both of your presentations outline both the risks and challenges and opportunities very thoughtfully. I think the question of which path AI takes us on with regard to healthy democracy or societal resilience will depend upon the question of power. And in this case, who or what will wield the power? The power of design, the power of economic resources, the power of regulatory oversight, the power of ethics. So I was wondering if you guys wanted to just weigh in on how you're thinking about the relevance of power as a question, what the ideal allocation of power might be in terms of the AI landscape in order to achieve those ideals that you describe and avoid some of those risks that are possible. Who or what should be in charge when we look at our AI futures?
Would you like to start, or should I?
Yeah, I think it's obviously the key question in the room, but it's also what is missing in your question is also kind of, can you achieve a legitimate power? Because we need that, as we know also from Max Weber's work, and we know that legitimate power allows you to enforce and implement those rules and be accepted by society. So I feel like that's really key to me. And then I really think we need we need a regulatory oversight, and at the same time, this oversight should allow for, as I said, for diversity and decentralization, so that different stakeholders can participate with it. And we have some examples how that could work or problems that arise if we think at the financial system or if we think at nuclear weapons and so on. So there are examples there, and there are experts in this domain that might help us to kind of shape the best, the best policies around it.
I really agree with the emphasis that there not only needs to be power, but legitimate power. And the first thing I would say, from a normative democratic perspective, is ultimately the power should belong to citizens. That's what will make it legitimate. And that's precisely the problem. How do citizens exercise power over massive tech companies they do not understand, whose operations are largely occluded from them, right? And that's also a problem for regulation. If you've looked at some congressional hearings concerning tech companies in the last decade, they are not exactly encouraging sights. Legislators literally do not know what they are talking about often when discussing technologies, and they're humiliated for it, right? And so I think the power problem is a really serious problem. I think regulation and strong informed regulation is certainly a part of the solution. The EU, from the vantage point of citizens' rights, is far ahead of the US on that front. But there we have a power problem as well. The EU does not have the big AI companies in it. It does not have the market power we do. And our regulations, on the other hand, are far less adequate, apart from national security concerns. Trump revoked Biden's executive order on AI, one of his first acts in the office, and so that's further complicated our regulatory situation here. I think a critical part of changing that dynamic, well, two things I would say. One, I do think there's a role for persuasion of AI companies themselves, that it is in their interest, precisely because AI is increasingly unpopular. We have a lot of polls showing that, right? There are lots of questions. What values are informing their development of AI, and so on. it is in their interest to actually have citizen input so they have compelling answers to those questions. And there are people, there's, for example, a deliberative Democrat entrepreneur, you could say, named Aviv Ovadia, who's explicitly trying to mobilize tech companies around that argument. But at the same time, I think you need citizen power, ultimately, to hold them accountable and to make AI an issue for the government. And so I think, we talked yesterday about how the Democratic Party is struggling for a vision for the future. I think AI regulation, if AI does indeed have such a potentially massive effect on so many factors of our society, AI has to be part of the new political program it's trying to formulate. How to make that compelling to citizens is going to be a communications challenge, but there's a lot to say, and there's already some public opinion to draw on.
Very thoughtful, and where you started us there is actually a topic that I wanted to throw a question to Anina. You talk about the kind of black box quality, the kind of lack of understanding and transparency that exists within these systems. Anina, what you presented on was a version of AI that is much more visible, much more tangible. And I'm wondering if you might want to reflect a little bit on the upshot of that visibility and that kind of tangibility of AI relative to much AI that operates in the background, that operates at the level of algorithms, that's sort of hidden from us, as opposed to the embodied robots and the embodied devices that you described there. I'm wondering if whether or not that visibility and that tangibility will raise more awareness about the impact of AI on our society, on our lives, on our politics, or could the opposite be true, which is that by having these robots take shape, do they induce some kind of anthropomorphization whereby we come to like and trust and be seduced by them because they are more visible and we project more human-like qualities on them, and in doing so, we are made blind to the impacts, perhaps nefarious, that they might have on our lives. How do you think about the kind of visibility and impact relation?
I mean, first of all, I think both embodied and non-embodied pose huge challenges, and there is not the one is kind of more threatful than the other. So in a sense, but I chose it because it's easier to think through some of the attributes of resilience that I showed you, just because it has this visible quality that is so important for us humans, and gestures and mimics and the feedback that we get. So that helps thinking to this, and interesting. I think you have to put it also in a chronological order. To me, it's probably at first there is kind of an aversion or a rejection of that, but that eventually will end up in more that trusting the system, which can be even more dangerous. So what we see now, for example, with some of the examples I showed you, this K5 patrolling robot, so it has been vandalized on the streets because people don't like that and distrust it. And same with the baby seal. People really attached deeply to this robot, bringing them, and they were aggressive when they would take it away, so they had to remove them So we see these challenges, but I think eventually we will come to trust these systems and integrate them, and it's really, and then it becomes really tricky. So I feel like we really have, from the beginning on, to be very clear that we want to have our human-centered resilience, and we don't want to allow these systems to be fully autonomously, because that's very dangerous.
Indeed. One more question for Nicholas, and then we'll open it up. Hopefully have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So many of the ideals or ideal terms that you articulate of deliberative democracy include things like reasoning, logic, accuracy, rationality, a kind of analytical mindedness. These are also the terms that define the promise and potential of big data, computational power, and AI itself. But humans are emotional, social, messy creatures, and I think especially if we have to define the value of the human in relation to AI and machines as they overtake our lives, our work, our relationships, and our landscapes, does deliberative democracy theory also have a place for value for that humanness? I mean, in other words, does deliberative democracy think about the ideal human interaction in terms that are quite similar to how AI thinks about data and interaction and sort of the human output? How would you kind of think about the kind of place or value of humanness as it relates to deliberative democracy?
That's a great question. And I should say that there are certainly people in Silicon Valley who make impassioned cases against democracy because of its failures on the grounds of rationality, the sort of epistemic criterion I was talking about earlier, and therefore say we should just be governed by optimizing artificial intelligences, right? That is a popular, albeit not always voiced, point of view among some in Silicon Valley. There are also political theorists, the epistocrats, for example, who are skeptics about democracy and on epistemic grounds, and likewise argue for potentially AI-mediated rule by experts. So the question of what is the value of democracy, how is it anchored in our value as humans, I think is a very urgent question right now. From the deliberative democratic perspective, and again, a range of opinions on this in the field, but the first thing I would say is that set of concerns really speaks to the first dimension I outlined, the epistemic dimension. But most deliberative Democrats would agree deliberative democracy rests on values as well as that. You can't really justify, well, some would argue you can, but I don't think you can fully justify values like equality or freedom or mutual respect, civility, purely on epistemic grounds. And so that raises a question, where do those values come from? Right? And here I think we get to something, as a theologian, I would highlight that often the values on which democracy depends do not come from democracy per se itself. Jürgen Habermas acknowledged that in some of his dialogues with religious leaders like Pope Benedict XVI. We may depend on values in secular societies that have deeper roots than our own secularity. And so I think there's a role for traditions, moral traditions, religious traditions, philosophical traditions that can articulate a deeply grounded identity and valuation of the human, to bring those into our public sphere today. Right? As a deliberative Democrat, I would say those values will be justified through the process of deliberation. But you can't just derive them necessarily. Right? And I think that's very important. I was just reading this morning the Vatican's document on artificial intelligence of Ancient and New Things, Antiqua et Nova, that came out about 2 months ago. And I think it's one of the most compelling articulations of the human in this context that I've yet encountered. I'm biased, I'm a Catholic theologian, so I would say that. But I would commend it to you if you want a sense of how you might go about that process. The starting point of that document is saying, what is the fundamental difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence? Right? We need to get clear on that first before we can answer a lot of these more applied ethical questions. And so I think that's very much a conversation we need to have.
Very thoughtful indeed. I do want to keep us very much on time, but I think we have an opportunity for one or two questions, and we'll just start right here.
This is a question mainly, I think, for the first two presenters, although I'd be interested to hear all three of you respond to it. In the first two presentations, at least, I heard more or less explicitly a common account of the threat that AI poses for democracy, which has to do with the ways in which AI can make certain forms of manipulation, disinformation, propaganda easier to produce, easier to disseminate, more seductive, so on and so forth. That's a compelling story. But what do you make of the growing literature that shows that some of the dynamics of incivility, of dysfunction, of willingness to use non-democratic means to get to achieve your ends are positively correlated with high degrees of political information? Mm-hmm. It looks as if misinformed people are far less vulnerable to certain forms of democratic dysfunction, and people who report high levels of political engagement, people for whom politics is very salient in their lives, self-reportedly, and people who seem to have a greater command of the facts seem more uncivil.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I take that research very much to heart. I think, to put a point on it, the more you know, the more you can deceive yourself, and the more you can dismiss other people who you don't think know what you do, right? And so being better informed does not necessarily mean being a better citizen or a better deliberator, quite the opposite. I think that's a larger thing we need to wrestle with as a society right now. And I think it also does, you also need to put it in the context of the fact that there is a gap in the education level of voters for who supports which political project, right? That also needs to be weighed into the calculus. But I think to the point about AI-generated misinformation, take the example of the last election in the US. If economic issues were indeed the #1 issue for voters, if inflation was a primary concern, particularly for lower information voters, how much information do they need to motivate them to take action on that issue? Potentially just encounters with a few pieces of disinformation. So even if you're not a high information consumer, misinformation or disinformation targeted in a particular way can, I think, highly influence your voting behavior. So it's still a problem, I would say. I'm not sure the solutions would look the same necessarily, and I wouldn't be one to say that AI is going to solve all of the problems it creates. But I do think there's a lot of pieces to that issue.
Thank you. Frank Garcia from the law school. Tremendous panel. I'll be thinking about it for days. Nicholas, you posed this question in your presentation of what can we do to influence the pathway? And I wanted to draw us back to something that you said, Michael, in your introduction, which was to pay attention to the words. And I was very struck with your example where the campaign that said the threat to your job is not AI, it's basically refusing to understand AI because someone else will. How potentially disastrous that kind of shift is. But I wanted to draw attention to another term that you mentioned that I think maybe we haven't been self-conscious enough about, which is the term content creator. I think that's already a very problematic term. And if we use the term content creator, we've given away too much. Because I think artists are not content creators, although their work can result in content. Teachers are not content creators, although our work results in content. And it seems to me in paying attention to words like that, we realize we've already conceded the main argument. And I wonder if there are other words like that circulating in this conversation that need that kind of attention.
It's such a great point. I could talk about this all day long. I think by seeding the term content creator, what we're doing is we're thinking along the lines of how the technologists want us to think, right? They're simply interested in the medium itself. It doesn't matter whether the thing that flows through their wires is an in-depth investigation of corruption at City Hall or a selfie by, an influencer, a micro-influencer, right? To them, the content itself is flattened, right? And it has no, it's all equally valued because it doesn't matter what's passing through the wires. It's just the wires are themselves what matters. So I suspect there's probably other language. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything, but I think your point about flattening the nuance and value, relative value of content to simply call it content is for sure a mistake.
I would just agree with that. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with Helen, a Clough Fellow, last night about a theological problem in the field, right? A lot of people are looking to AI for answers to their theological questions. And this is raising a lot of problems for religious institutions. But I think one question it raises is like, can AI interpret the Bible? It depends on what you understand interpretation to be. I'm a Gadamerarian, for anyone for whom that means anything. I think interpretation is a radically humanistic act. It presupposes certain qualities of ourselves as embodied interpretive animals. I don't think AI can do interpretation in the way we do interpretation. And yet, on a more minimalistic understanding of it, of course it's interpreting things. It's telling you a particular take on the Bible. It's generated somehow. And so I think it gets back to this fundamental question the Vatican is now raising. What is the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence on all of the things human intelligence can do and create? That being said, I am not at all intentional always about the differences in my own language. So after your comment, I will try to be more so. Thank you.
Hi, I'm the Helen in that story. I'm from psychology department, and I actually come with good news that at least in my field, that people's reaction towards we're not using content here, but the information, whether generated by people or generated by AI, pretty much starts and ends at confirmation bias based on which team they are. So it's like the idea of AI will propaganda and misinformation is overestimated. At least that's the belief in my field. So, but it doesn't mean that AI does not bring certain benefits in using as a propaganda tool. At least it makes it easier to make people feel heard. So that's my question. Why the attempt of using AI is pretty much limited on one side rather than the other?
Can you say that last question just again, just rephrase?
So it might have some. It doesn't make people change their mind on which parties they support by having conversation with Trump on tariff or water pressure, but it makes people feel heard. It makes people. It has certain attraction to rally the support. But that technique or that strategy is pretty much limited on only one side, not the other. So any response to that or any thoughts on that?
Only the side being the political side? In other words, like you're seeing it far more among conservatives than you are leftists? Is that what you're saying?
We haven't seen anything from the left side on, I don't know, a Biden AI may not be attractive as a Trump AI, but you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, so the research that you describe is certainly new to me in this moment. I think putting it in a what maybe I can offer in response to the question is putting it in a wider context, which is that if you look at the arc of digital politics over the past 20 years or so, the story in the 2000s and really early 2010s was that the Democrats and the left had really figured out political strategy online, right? And that was the kind of narrative, right? Trump comes along in 2016, and depending on how you want to interpret the impact of the Internet Research Agency outside of St. Petersburg, sort of troll propagandists that were sort of pushing content into the Facebook newsfeed slipstream. At that point forward, it felt like the Republican Party was being much more effective in terms of political strategy and political communication online. And I don't know that and that has carried through with the last election, where I think the narrative was largely about the right making good use of online influencers, podcasters, things like that. So for me, it may simply be a sort of, the patterns that you describe may possibly be a product of the advantage that the right has cultivated in those spaces compared to the left at this point, and compared to the Democratic Party, I should say. But these things change, right? And like it could well be that the Democrats rediscover their mojo with regard to what they did in 2008 in Obama, right? And how that powered the movement at that time. So anything else?
I just wanted to wave in on something that I feel like the clip you showed at the beginning, so it apparently was done pretty quickly, I think in a couple of hours or so. And so, I mean, these technologies are improving so massively, and pretty soon we will not be able to discern whether this is fake or real. So, and similarly to what you said about translation, now we might still have the capability to critically analyze a text and say so, although I doubt already now, but soon that will no longer be the case. So the question to me is also kind of what will that make with trust? Because I feel like if you know that it's produced by a nice system, we somehow almost trust it less, or we are like less willing kind of to, but that might also change. And so it's really also an adaptation of our side and what we want. So in a sense, it goes a bit beyond of what you said, but it's just something that keeps circulating in my head.
The question and I want to offer one more question after this, but just what you say, the relationship of trust and truth brings me to think about something that I've read over the years with regard to Putin's Russia, which is that the use of propaganda in Russia is not necessarily to get you to believe in what Putin is selling. It's to believe that nothing is true at all, right? And that AI has the capacity to build upon the sense of misinformation on social media, which has sort of already been at play, which is that the goal with even something like that grotesque AI clip that you saw at the beginning is not necessarily to believe that that's the truth, but to rather get us to doubt the foundations of truth themselves, right? Which has an advantage in certain workings of power.
If I could jump in really quickly, one last point point I'd want to make in response is it's relevant to consider the political alignment of Silicon Valley itself, which has changed. Right? Part of the reasons the Democrats had such a good game earlier was because Silicon Valley was really on their side pretty monolithically. When Peter Thiel came out in favor of Trump the first time, that was a real outlier. And now you have a lot more of Silicon Valley that's gravitated to Trump, even before his election, in part out of reaction to the more aggressive attempt of the Biden administration to regulate them. Right? And so managing the politics of Silicon Valley when it has so much power is a very formidable task in itself. And I think that does have something to do with the dynamic we're describing.
Such a great point. One last question right there. We'll get you a microphone for the volume.
Thanks so much for your presentations, very provocative. I have a framing question, and it relates to the role of the non-human, the interface of the non-human and AI. We've talked about the downward spiral and the dystopian vision possibility of AI, but the alternative to that was resilience, where humans are the proper custodians of this technology. But what kind of literature is out there about the interface between climate change and the degradation of the planet and AI that could present the possibility that the environment could be the disruptor that that we're looking for, the climate catastrophes, the tornadoes, the whatever it might be? Sorry, it's a bit of a question from left field, but it's what I was thinking about when there was so much emphasis on the human.
So you're wondering kind of if the same mechanisms are at play, or if how AI can help or can?
How does the discussion, the conversation about AI, the interface discussion, climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit what I kind of tried to do with my presentation, is to show a concept that is so widely used, especially in disaster research and in climate change, and to show how we can kind of use that to think through some of the opportunities and challenges of AI. Because as climate change, AI is a huge disruption, and we know, I think this concept of resilience is really intriguing, because obviously there's the possibility to absorb this as with climate change, but I think we will not be able to absorb it. We have to react. So there is also this idea, so you have to think, okay, what if the risk is so big that we have to react and take action, and similarly in climate change. So there's a lot of parallels you can make with what you just said. And I just think it's helpful because at the end we are a system as well, and within the system we have communities, but we know what keeps us together and what will be helpful when we face these challenges. So I think that's really key, that we can pin it down to what needs to be done. So that's the first step, how you can think to that. Yeah. I hope that went a bit.
Well, thank you so much for the very thoughtful questions. Please join me in thanking the panelists today.